Min's case is one of the most disturbing stories that I've reported on in over 7 years of doing journalism on modern slavery and trafficking.
He was clearly a survivor of trafficking who needed support and assistance rather than being criminalised, detained and almost deported.
It was a gross miscarriage of justice. I still think it's staggering, even in 2013, that police can go into a house, a locked house, find a 16-year-old Vietnamese boy who speaks no English and believe that he is there profiting from the cultivation of all of these plants that they found at the top of the house. It's a completely parallel world. It's a completely parallel economy. It's this shadowy second world that is happening all around us, but we don't see it. My name's Annie Kelly. I'm a journalist and an editor at The Guardian newspaper. So since 2011, I've been reporting on modern slavery and trafficking. I was running a project that was one of the first times a global media organisation had attempted to really do some serious forensic reporting into modern slavery and human trafficking and trying to just understand what was behind it, what was driving it, what kind of different forms it was taking.
My name is Ahmed Aidid. I'm a Public Law Director at Duncan Lewis. I predominantly work with survivors of trafficking, survivors of torture, asylum seekers, refugees, and those who can't afford to pay for legal representation and who wish to bring a challenge against a public body. There are more people in modern slavery now than any time before.
I think many people think about modern slavery, human trafficking, and they imagine people being tied up or physically restrained or, shackled to a radiator. It doesn't work like that. The kind of psychological bonds and the psychological control that traffickers are able to exert over their victims often mean that physical force is not the first mode of control.
There are people around us now who are being forced into debt bondage, who are trafficked from other countries into the UK and forced to cultivate cannabis, forced to work in brothels.
The nail bars, the restaurants, the car washes. It's a completely parallel world. It's a completely parallel economy. It's this shadowy second world that is happening all around us, but we don't see it. So I came across Min's story as part of my wider reporting on child trafficking in the UK and looking at those links between Vietnamese children and the cannabis trade. I was in touch with many lawyers who were working on cases related to the criminalisation and detention of child trafficking victims in the UK.
In 2017, I was informed of Min's case through a legal surgery, and I was shocked at the summary that was provided by my colleague in relation to what happened to Min and why he was imprisoned, which I thought from the outset I could tell that there were clear indicators that this was someone who's a victim of trafficking and should really not be in detention. Annie, Min and I sat together and we assisted Annie in being able to tell Min's story and explain how public authorities simply fail to protect survivors.
When I first met Min, I met him in a safe house in late 2018 after he'd just been released from immigration detention. He seemed quite composed, but as we started talking, it became very quickly clear of that kind of mask slipped and you could suddenly see the child that had been in that cannabis house 3 years before. I started to build a story of what had happened to him since he left Vietnam. Min was born in the mid-1990s in South Vietnam in a really rural area. His parents were smallholder farmers who were really struggling to make ends meet. He wanted to leave, he wanted to start making money for his family. He didn't want to stay and be a farmer because he saw that there was no future in that for him. There is this idea that the UK is still the place where you will be able to find work and you will be able to support your family back home. Min told me that he started speaking to a group of his friends from school who were talking about work opportunities in Ho Chi Minh City. He managed to raise the money for the bus fare to Ho Chi Minh, so he left his family. He said that he was going to be back in a few months, but he's never seen them again. When he reached Ho Chi Minh City, he said he met up with these friends and they kind of kicked around the city for a few days. And then these friends told him that they had met a group of men that would be able to find them work. His friends didn't seem to know these men very well, and it seemed obvious that they had brought him to this house as part of a kind of prior arrangement with these men. They told him that they could find him work in the UK and he had to sign a document saying that he would pay back £10,000. He told them he didn't want to go, he wanted to leave. He then said that they got violent, they beat him with sticks, They sexually assaulted him. They kept him in this room in this house in Ho Chi Minh City for 2 or 3 days where he was consistently brutalised and abused before he agreed to sign this piece of paper. That was the beginning of his trafficking journey to the UK. And he then said that he was flown to the Czech Republic and travelled overland through Europe for a number of months before reaching France and being put in the back of a lorry over the Channel into the UK, where he was then picked up and taken to a house in Derbyshire. His recollections of that journey paints a very, very distressing and dark story of what children and young people experience on that overland route to the UK. 2 weeks after he arrived at the house, and they brought plants, big green plants, lots of lighting equipment, and they essentially bashed this house into a makeshift cannabis farm. Min says that the experience of being in that house was a terrifying ordeal from which he doesn't know he'll ever recover. He was on his own. He wasn't allowed to turn on any lights. He was forced to grow these plants, and he was constantly terrified that he would be killed if those plants died. 3 months later, when the police finally raided the property, amid the chaos of the police raid, Min said that he really thought that now he was being rescued, that this was the moment that he would be able to leave the house and would find a place of safety. But instead he was arrested and charged with cannabis cultivation.
I'm a supervising solicitor, so what I did is, as soon as I took Min's case on, we sat down together and pieced this case together and tried to find out what actually happened here. My questions were, why was Min in detention? Why was he criminalised? Why was he detained? Why was he not assisted at the point at which he was apprehended by the police?
From the point of being charged with cannabis cultivation, Min's journey into the criminal justice system was set. And once you're in that system, and once you've been criminalised and you have a criminal record, it's so hard to get people out. It's so hard to get those children identified as victims once they've already been criminalised. I reported on Min's story over the case of about 1.5 years, which culminated in a long read for The Guardian where we told his whole story from start to finish. Throughout that time, I worked really closely with Ahmed.
I worked with Annie on this case because this was a clear case of trafficking, but there is a lot of misinformation out there in terms of the public, but also in terms of the public knowing what the government does when it comes across survivors of trafficking. Annie and I got together and we went through the papers. We highlighted all of the failings by public authorities to pick up on vital information.
When the police raided the house in Derbyshire in 2013, they failed to pick up on the indicators that Min was a victim of child trafficking.
16-year-old in a cannabis house, surrounded by complicated equipment, doesn't speak the language, locked in. Alarm bell should have been ringing.
They then failed to relate that information to the CPS, who charged him with cannabis cultivation, and he was then sentenced to 8 months in Glenparva.
Min was transferred to immigration detention. He wasn't seen by a GP within the first 24 hours. He wasn't identified that he was a potential victim of trafficking or torture. What happened subsequent to that is actually Min, when he was transferred to immigration detention, he was sexually assaulted.
Instead of investigating that, the Moreton Hall, the immigration centre, failed to take any action to protect him. There had just been a series of grave errors in his case that had exposed him to years of illegal detention at the hands of the UK government.
After 7 years and 12 legal challenges, Min was finally granted the right to remain in the UK, and he was finally granted international protection. At the end of 2019, when Min had finally successfully appealed his conviction, and it was then made clear that what happened years ago when he was convicted of cannabis cultivation was wrong, and he's in fact not a criminal, but a survivor of trafficking. I remember speaking with Min and was really happy that he'd finally had his claim vindicated, but also really sad in the fact that it's taken so many years just to simply right a wrong. I was able to speak to Annie afterwards as well and tell her the good news. I mean, we were really happy and ecstatic.
I remember very vividly getting the call from Ahmed, just the joy and the relief that he felt, that I felt, and that Min felt at this finally happening. Finally, he was recognised that he wasn't a criminal, that he had been a victim. It's also bittersweet because you think of all the effort, all the resources, all the time it took to get justice for him. So it feels like, on one hand, it's a really happy ending, on the other, it just is a drop in the ocean, and that so much more work needs to be done to try and help and get legal support to people who really urgently need it.
Unfortunately, we continue to see cases such as Min on a regular basis. And unfortunately, we continue to see survivors being detained, criminalised and deported.
It was a gross miscarriage of justice. And what happened to Min will, both at the hands of his traffickers but also at the hands of the UK government, will remain with him for the rest of his life.